Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. On the sprawling alien medical station, situated among the stars on the edge of a dying galaxy, Nurse Lyra worked tirelessly, her bioluminescent green skin glowing softly in the sterile, humming halls. She had seen countless species pass through the station's gates, each one with its own set of injuries and afflictions. But none were as intriguing as the human she now stood before. Humanity, at least as far as the Galactic Council was concerned, had always been seen as a lesser species. No advanced technology, no intricate political alliances, just a young, raw race trying to carve out its place among the cosmos. Despite their resilience, their fragile bodies had been the subject of ridicule for decades. They were seen as emotional and impulsive, quick to anger, quick to love, quick to die. And yet, Lyra could not help but be curious. The human male she now cared for had been brought into the station battered and unconscious, his body showing signs of intense physical trauma. His name, as his identification had stated, was Lieutenant Jason Carter of the United Earth Alliance. His ship had been ambushed while exploring a newly discovered planet, and he had been the only survivor, with most of his crew left behind in the wreckage. She adjusted the medical scanner over his chest, watching as the device whirred to life, analyzing the various injuries. Broken ribs, bruised organs, extensive blood loss. The machine did its best to make sense of his damage, but there was something strange, something not fully understood about humans. They survived wounds that would leave others gasping for breath, their healing processes were unpredictable, almost otherworldly. Lyra adjusted her medical gown and walked closer to him, her heart racing at the proximity. It wasn't often that a human came to the station alive, and rarer still was the opportunity to study them firsthand. She found herself captivated by the idea that, despite all their apparent weakness, there was something about them that intrigued her. Her blue eyes skimmed his face, a sharp contrast to the usual pale, grayish tones of the other species she treated. His features were sharp, defined. There was an unmistakable intensity in his expression even in unconsciousness, like his mind was still somewhere far away, lost in the chaos of battle. She had seen many faces like his in the past, faces that told the stories of their species' violence and wars. But this one held something else. A quiet hum from the medical scanner broke her reverie. She glanced at the readout. There were readings she hadn't expected. Despite the human's outward injuries, there was a strange, almost dormant energy coursing through his veins. The medical scan revealed faint pulses of electricity, fluctuating unpredictably, as if his body were somehow channeling energy from a source unknown. She frowned. Her people had developed advanced technology to understand the biology of almost every species in the galaxy, yet this anomaly was beyond their knowledge. Could it be a mistake? Lyra whispered to herself. She pressed the scanner closer to his skin, hoping the data would make sense. But there was no error. As she studied his face again, something caught her eye. His hand twitched. The slightest movement, but it was enough to send a jolt of anxiety down her spine. She stepped back instinctively. It wasn't supposed to happen. Human reflexes weren't that fast, not after the kind of injuries he had sustained. Lyra hesitated, then moved to adjust the life support machines nearby. The screen displayed steady, albeit labored, vitals. His body was clearly on the brink of death, but somehow, it held on. She frowned and examined his heart rate. It wasn't normal. The beats were erratic, fluctuating in a way she had never seen. More pulses of electricity rippled through the data. What is happening to him? Lyra wondered, her mind racing with the possibilities. She had seen humans overcome the odds before, surviving wounds, fighting through pain, but nothing like this. Before she could decide on her next course of action, Jason's eyes fluttered open. His gaze was wild, unblinking, as though he was trying to absorb the reality around him. His breaths were shallow, ragged, but his focus was clear. Lyra stepped back, unsure of how to proceed, when his voice cracked through the silence. Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Humans didn't wake up so suddenly after the level of trauma he had experienced. They usually needed much more time, even with advanced treatments. "You are on the Orlis medical station," Lyra replied cautiously, her voice soft. "You've been injured in a crash. Your ship was attacked." Jason's eyes narrowed as if trying to piece together the fragmented memory. "The crew. They didn't make it." "You're the only survivor," she said gently. His breathing grew more erratic, but his hand clenched into a fist, fingers trembling with effort. It was an unexpected reaction. Lyra could feel the air shift, a strange tension building as she observed the human's body. Then, without warning, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with unnatural strength. Lyra gasped, her body jolting at the intensity of his grip. It was as though a surge of energy had just coursed through him, something primal, something terrifying. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was ironclad. His eyes locked with hers, and for the first time, she saw something that chilled her to the bone, fear. Not of the unknown, but of what he might be capable of. "What have you done to me?" Jason's voice was low, dangerously controlled. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, her mind scrambling for answers. Something was wrong. This human, this seemingly fragile man, was hiding something deep inside, a power that was beginning to reveal itself, something that terrified even her. Lyra struggled to free herself from Jason's grip, her mind racing to process what was happening. His hand was like steel, the warmth of his skin searing against her own. But it wasn't just the strength of his grip that unnerved her, it was the faint crackling sound she could feel in the air around them, like electricity building up in the space between them. Her skin tingled with the sensation, and she could sense something primal, something wild and dangerous in his touch. "Let go of me," Lyra ordered, trying to keep her voice calm. She had encountered many species with bizarre and unpredictable abilities, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. Jason's eyes were locked on hers, a strange mixture of confusion and terror behind the piercing blue depths. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He seemed to be fighting something within himself. The energy he was radiating was tangible, like an electric storm gathering strength. What have you done to me?" His voice trembled, barely a whisper, but Lyra could feel the underlying fury in his words. "I haven't done anything," she replied, her voice a little more forceful now as she pulled her wrist with all her strength. His grip only tightened. "You're injured. You were brought in unconscious." Jason's lips parted as if he was about to speak, but suddenly his body tensed, and his eyes rolled back. The crackling sensation in the air intensified, and for a moment, Lyra feared he might be convulsing. But then, just as quickly as it had begun, the tension seemed to snap. Jason's hand released her wrist, and he collapsed back onto the medical bed with a ragged gasp, his body trembling. Lyra staggered back, rubbing her wrist where he had gripped her, her heart hammering in her chest. What had just happened? She had seen many patients in distress, but none with such an overwhelming, otherworldly power. Jason's body seemed to vibrate with residual energy, the air around him still charged. She could feel the static crackling through the room, like an electric storm waiting to break free. What was that? Lyra muttered to herself, eyes scanning the human's limp form. Was this some kind of strange biological reaction to his injuries? But the data from the medical scanner hadn't mentioned anything about energy surges or electrical anomalies. Jason groaned softly, and Lyra's attention snapped back to him. He was still unconscious, but his breathing had steadied somewhat. The violent pulse of energy had dissipated, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. She wasn't sure if she should feel relieved or terrified. Cautiously, Lyra approached the bed, her medical instincts kicking in despite the fear that coiled in her stomach. She checked the vitals again, and this time, the reading seemed more stable. His heart rate was erratic, but within a tolerable range. The scan still showed unusual energy fluctuations, but it had diminished for the moment. However, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong. There was an unnatural quality to this energy. It wasn't something her species had ever encountered in the vast array of lifeforms they had studied. She'd dealt with various telepathic species, energy manipulators, and bio-enhanced creatures, but this was different. This wasn't some latent ability honed over years of training or genetic modification. This felt raw. Untamed. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, casting the room into darkness for a split second before returning to their usual, clinical brightness. Lyra froze. The surge of energy. Could it have caused that? She turned back to Jason, studying his face. His expression was contorted with pain, but his eyes remained closed. The energy she had felt earlier had subsided, but something told her it was only temporary. Whatever was inside him wasn't finished. Lyra leaned against the wall, trying to collect her thoughts. She had to figure out what was happening to this human, what made him different from any other species she had encountered. She had been trained to help, to heal, but there were limits to what even her vast medical knowledge could understand. The medical station's artificial intelligence, a soothing, disembodied voice that assisted with diagnoses, suddenly chimed in, breaking the silence. Warning, subject's neural and bioelectric activity detected. Unusual power fluctuations continue to rise. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The AI's analysis seemed to confirm her fears. Whatever Jason was experiencing, it wasn't a result of his injuries. This was something inherent to him, something that no medical technology could easily explain. But why hadn't it manifested earlier, when he first arrived? Why now, when he was already in critical condition? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, guttural groan from Jason. His fingers twitched, then curled into a fist, his body lifting slightly off the bed. His chest rose and fell with labored breaths, and the faint electrical hum returned. This time, it seemed to pulse, growing stronger. No, Lyra whispered, stepping back, her eyes wide with realization. It wasn't just his body healing, it was the energy inside him, struggling to break free. Jason's eyes snapped open, and for a brief, terrifying moment, it felt like his gaze pierced through her. His pupils were wide, dilated with intensity, and his expression was a mixture of agony and rage. His lips parted, and for a second, it seemed as though he might speak. Instead, his body jerked violently as a surge of power erupted from him. The lights in the room flickered again, this time longer. The medical equipment nearby buzzed with interference, the holographic displays glitching and flickering. Lyra felt an overwhelming pressure in the air, like the space around them was being compressed. Then, without warning, a crackling bolt of energy shot from Jason's body. It was brief, less than a second, but it was enough to send a shockwave across the room. The medical equipment shattered, sparks flying as the walls shook with the intensity of the surge. Lyra stumbled back, shielding herself instinctively as debris fell around her. The station's AI voice chimed in urgently, its tone now frantic. Warning. Power loss detected. Internal systems compromised. Jason collapsed back onto the bed, his body going limp once more. The surge of energy abruptly ceased. The room was silent again, but the damage was evident. The lights flickered once more before stabilizing. The walls hummed with an eerie quiet, and the station's systems began to struggle to recover. Lyra stood frozen in place, her heart racing. She had never seen anything like this before. This human, this man, he was more than just a survivor of a crash. He was a weapon, a force of nature in his own right. And if he couldn't control it, if he couldn't control himself, the consequences could be catastrophic. The question now was, could she help him? Or was he too dangerous to be allowed to live? Lyra stared at the wreckage in the room, her pulse pounding in her ears. The medical equipment lay in ruins, the once sterile environment now littered with shattered glass and metal fragments. She could feel the tension still hanging in the air, a low hum vibrating against her skin as the energy Jason had released continued to ripple through the station's walls. The strange, unexplained power within him had left its mark, an unsettling reminder that humanity, this lesser species, might hold more than she had ever imagined. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the medical station's emergency systems kicking in. Lyra's mind raced, torn between fear and fascination. What she had just witnessed couldn't have been a mere reaction to his injuries. There was something far deeper, more dangerous, hidden inside this human. Jason's chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. He was unconscious again, his face pale, lips tight with a grimace. The once vibrant blue of his eyes had faded into a dull, exhausted hue. His body was twitching involuntarily, and Lyra could sense the residual energy still crackling beneath his skin. She didn't know how long she stood there, frozen in place, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, the sound of the station's AI broke the silence, its voice now a low, urgent tone. Warning, power levels unstable. Immediate recalibration required. Lyra forced herself to move, stepping away from the wreckage and back to the medical console. She was trying to push down the panic that had taken hold of her, but the weight of the situation was becoming harder to ignore. This wasn't just a medical emergency anymore. This was an unknown, an anomaly that she was ill-equipped to handle. Her training had never prepared her for something like this. She reached for the medical scanner, attempting to assess Jason's condition again, but the device blinked out, unable to function. Under the surge of power. Her hand hovered over it, her mind working furiously. She needed data. She needed answers. But the machines couldn't give her the information she needed. Jason groaned, his body shifting slightly. His eyes flickered open again, this time more slowly. He blinked several times, as if struggling to focus on the unfamiliar surroundings. His gaze landed on her, and for a moment, there was a strange recognition in his eyes, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. "You're still alive," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to herself or to him. Jason tried to sit up, but his body wouldn't cooperate. His muscles trembled weakly, and his breathing became more labored as if the energy inside him was fighting against the restraints of his physical form. "Damn it," Jason muttered under his breath, his voice strained with pain. "What the hell is happening to me?" Lyra hesitated. She wanted to explain, to tell him that she didn't know, that she didn't have the answers. But she couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, she moved closer, carefully kneeling by his side. You're safe for now. But you need to rest. Your body, there's something wrong with it." Jason turned his head toward her, his eyes flickering with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Safe?" His voice was thick with bitterness. "I'm not safe. I'm a walking disaster. I can't control it. I can't even think straight." His hand gripped the edge of the bed as if he were trying to anchor himself, but the tremors running through his body only intensified. The air around him seemed to hum louder, the static in the room growing more intense with each passing second. Lyra's heart sank as she watched him struggle. The fear she had felt earlier now morphed into something darker, concern, pity. She had known humans were resilient, but this wasn't resilience. This was something else entirely. "There has to be a way to stop it," Lyra said, more to herself than to him. "Whatever this power is, it's not sustainable. You'll destroy yourself." Jason's lips curled into a humorless smile. "That's the plan, right? Just burn out and take everyone down with me." He grimaced, his hand still clutching the bed frame. "I'm not the hero. I never was. I was just a soldier. A disposable piece of the bigger picture." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Lyra felt a sharp pang of sympathy for him. She had seen many wounded soldiers in her years of service, those who had been broken, both physically and mentally. But this was different. This human, this man, was carrying a burden that no one, not even the most advanced species in the galaxy, could comprehend. "You're not disposable," Lyra said softly. "You don't have to be. Whatever this power is, it's not the end of you." Jason let out a bitter laugh, but it was weak, more of a reflex than a genuine chuckle. "What good is a power if you can't control it? I can't even stop it from destroying everything around me. The ship, my crew." Lyra felt her heart twist at his words. She had known the pain of loss, though it was different for her kind. But she could sense the deep sorrow in Jason's voice. He wasn't just fighting a strange force inside him, he was fighting the guilt of being the last survivor. "You are in control," Lyra said, her voice firm despite the chaos unfolding in her mind. "The power is not you. It's something your body is doing. It's reacting to the trauma. You can learn to control it." Jason looked at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Control it? It's a bomb inside me. It'll go off when it's ready." Lyra shook her head, her hand steady as she gently touched his shoulder. "Not if you learn how to direct it. But you need to calm down. You need to focus." For a moment, Jason just stared at her, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. It was clear he didn't believe her. How could he? He was on the verge of collapse, his body racked with energy he couldn't understand or contain. But Lyra was determined. She knew that this was no ordinary human. She had seen enough of the galaxy's strange and wondrous species to know when something defied explanation. And Jason was something entirely different. "You're going to help me," Lyra said, her voice calm but unwavering. "We're going to figure this out together." Jason didn't respond immediately. His eyes flickered with doubt, but there was a flicker of something else, something like hope, beneath the layers of anger and fear. As the silence settled between them, the strange energy in the air seemed to recede slightly. It was still there, like a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer overwhelming. For the first time since the surge of power had erupted, Jason closed his eyes, his body finally going still. The room, once filled with tension, now seemed quieter, more controlled. But Lyra knew it wasn't over. This was just the beginning. And whatever was inside Jason, whatever power he carried, it was about to unravel in ways neither of them could predict. The silence in the room was oppressive. Lyra sat in the dim glow of the medical station, watching Jason with a mixture of caution and curiosity. His body was still, his breathing even, as if he had fallen into a deep, restless sleep. The crackling energy that had once surrounded him had receded, but Lyra could still feel its faint tremor in the air, like the aftershocks of a thunderstorm that refused to completely pass. She knew better than to trust this fragile calm. The energy within Jason had not been subdued, it had merely retreated into the depths of his body, waiting for the right moment to explode once more. As she observed him, Lyra couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was crucial. The human had proven to be unlike any other species she had ever encountered. His power, raw and unpredictable, was both a blessing and a curse. If they didn't find a way to control it, if Jason couldn't learn to manage what was inside him, it could tear him apart, and everyone around him. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft whir of the medical console coming back online. The system had managed to stabilize itself after the previous surge of power, though it remained in a precarious state. She glanced at the blinking indicators, checking for any signs of malfunction. Fortunately, the station's emergency systems were holding, but she knew they couldn't afford another breach like the last one. The question now was how to move forward. Jason had to be treated, but more importantly, he needed to understand what he was dealing with. His power wasn't just a side effect of his injuries, it was part of him, a part he had no control over. And that lack of control was the most dangerous thing about him. Lyra gently placed a hand on the edge of the bed, watching his features closely. His body was still tense, his fists clenched at his sides, as if fighting against something unseen. She had seen this before in others, wounded soldiers, survivors of war, people who had suffered far more than any living being should. But Jason wasn't just a survivor of war, he was something more. The energy within him was beyond anything Lyra had witnessed, and its unpredictable nature made him a threat to everyone in the station. Still, she couldn't help but feel a strange empathy for him. The human species had always been considered volatile, unrefined, but there was a certain fire within them, a tenacity that Lyra had found both admirable and disconcerting. They fought, not just for survival, but for something more, a will to live that defied reason. And Jason. Jason was the epitome of that. Jason, Lyra said softly, her voice breaking the silence. You need to wake up. I know it's painful, but you have to face this. You have to control it before it controls you. For a long moment, there was no response. Jason's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, and his face remained serene, as though he were lost in a dream. But Lyra could see the tension in his muscles, the tightness around his jaw. He was aware, even if his mind was still drifting somewhere beyond consciousness. Jason, she repeated, her voice firmer this time. You're not alone in this. I can help you, but you need to trust me. His eyes snapped open, locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, Lyra could have sworn she saw something akin to recognition in his gaze, a flicker of understanding beneath the confusion and fear that had consumed him earlier. His lips parted, but it was clear he was struggling to find the words. Jason's voice was rough, barely above a whisper. He coughed, wincing as the effort caused pain to ripple through his body. I can't control it. You can, Lyra said, her voice low but insistent. I've seen it before. The energy inside you, it's part of you, yes. But that doesn't mean it controls you. You have the power to direct it. Jason shook his head weakly, his hands twitching at his sides. I don't know how. I don't know what it is. I don't even understand what's happening. Lyra could see the panic creeping back into his eyes, the fear that he was losing control, that the power within him would erupt again, and this time, there would be nothing she could do to stop it. You don't need to understand everything all at once, she said, trying to calm him. Just focus. Focus on your breath, on controlling your body. You can do it, Jason. You just need to trust yourself. The energy in the room seemed to shift. Jason's body was still trembling, but the air around him, which had once been thick with the crackling hum of uncontrolled power, began to settle. The low, electric pulse that had filled the space started to fade, gradually receding like a storm passing over the horizon. Lyra remained close, her eyes fixed on Jason's face, watching for any sign that the power was about to surge again. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, but there was something in his expression now, something different. The fear was still there, but it was now mixed with determination. He was trying. Slowly, Jason took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling in a slow, measured rhythm. Lyra could see the subtle tension in his body as he focused. His muscles, still bruised from the injuries sustained during the crash, relaxed ever so slightly. His fingers, which had been curled tightly into fists, slowly unfurled, and his breath became steadier. For the first time since he had regained consciousness, Jason's face softened. He closed his eyes for a moment, the muscles around his brow easing, as if he were finding some small measure of peace. And then, the room flickered again. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The lights dimmed, the hum of the medical equipment faltered for a moment, and she could feel it, the pressure of the energy in the air, just beneath the surface, threatening to rise again. But this time, it wasn't the chaotic, uncontrollable surge that had nearly shattered the room before. This time, it was different. Jason's body pulsed with a strange rhythm, his chest rising and falling in time with the beat of the energy that flowed through him. The electricity wasn't just running rampant inside him, it was moving in patterns, in sync with his body's natural movements. Jason's eyes snapped open, locking with Lyra's. He was sweating, his face pale with exhaustion, but there was a clarity in his gaze now, a focused intent that hadn't been there before. "I can feel it," he said, his voice low but steady. "It's there, inside me. But I can control it. I can direct it." Lyra felt a surge of relief. For the first time since she had met him, there was hope. Jason wasn't just fighting the power anymore, he was learning to wield it. Slowly, carefully, with all the caution of a soldier who had learned the hard way to control his weapons. The static in the air had lessened, the storm inside him beginning to calm. Jason's breaths grew deeper, more even, and his body was no longer trembling. He was still struggling, but now it was a struggle of choice, not desperation. "Good," Lyra whispered, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You're doing it. You're in control." But as she watched him, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Jason had made a crucial step toward mastering his power, but there were still many unknowns. The force within him was still dangerous, and the consequences of losing control were too great to ignore. Lyra knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with peril. But for the first time, she believed it was possible. And that belief was enough to give her the strength to push forward. Jason sat in the bed, his body still intense, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. The energy that had once erupted inside him like an uncontrollable storm now felt more like a distant, pulsing undercurrent, waiting for its moment to resurface. His mind was clearer than it had been in days, maybe longer, but that clarity came with a new weight. He could feel the power inside him. It was alive, thrumming beneath his skin like a hidden beast, its presence both comforting and terrifying. But he could also feel something else, something more than just the energy. It was a feeling of responsibility, the weight of knowing that this power could be as much a curse as a blessing. He had barely begun to learn how to control it, and even now, he feared it would break free, wreaking havoc on everything around him. Lyra stood beside the bed, watching him with quiet intensity. The look in her eyes was different now, less of a healer tending to an injured patient and more of someone who was guiding him through an unknown, dangerous path. She had been patient with him, teaching him how to focus, how to control the bursts of energy that threatened to tear him apart. But now, it was time for the next step. She had taken him this far, but she couldn't do it for him. "How do you feel?" Lyra asked softly, her voice gentle but steady, like a calm before a storm. Jason blinked, his eyes momentarily distant as he focused inward. The energy had settled, for the most part, but it was still there, pulsing in the depths of his being, waiting for a signal to surge forward. He had to stay in control. He had to stay focused. "It's manageable," he said slowly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "But I can feel it, Lyra. It's alive in me. It wants to break free. It wants to destroy everything," she finished for him, her voice soft but firm, as if the words were something they had both accepted without need for further explanation. Jason's lips tightened at her words. He hadn't needed to say them aloud. He'd known that's what the power wanted. It wanted chaos. It wanted to burn everything down and leave nothing in its wake. And it was inside him, ready to explode. "I can't promise that it'll always be under control," Jason said, his voice thick with frustration. "But I don't know how long I can keep this up. It's too much." Lyra's gaze softened. She had seen the strain on his face, the way his body trembled when the energy spiked even the slightest bit. Jason wasn't a soldier anymore. He was something else entirely now, something that had the potential to reshape the universe, if it didn't destroy him first. "You don't have to do this alone," she said gently. "I'll help you, Jason. You've already come so far. But you need to understand this, whatever it is, it's not just some tool you can wield. It's part of you. You'll never be able to fully control it if you keep thinking of it as something separate. Jason's brow furrowed as he absorbed her words. Part of me, he repeated under his breath. It was the truth, he knew it. This power wasn't something he could fight or run from. It was embedded in every fiber of his being, woven into the very essence of who he was now. You have to accept it, Lyra continued, her tone steady but unwavering. Embrace it, and learn to guide it. You can't fight what you are. Jason looked at her, his gaze steady, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Could he really do this? Could he truly control this force without losing himself in the process? I've never had control of my life, he muttered bitterly, his voice barely above a whisper. I've always been a tool. A weapon. A pawn in someone else's game. I don't even know who I am anymore. Lyra's expression softened as she knelt beside him, her eyes meeting his. Then let me help you find out. You're not just a weapon. You never were. The power inside you is just an extension of your will. Your humanity. Your heart. It's all there, Jason. Don't let it consume you. Jason stared at her for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. The calm certainty in her eyes, the way she believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself, it was disarming. He had never known someone who would offer that kind of faith, especially not in him. He had been a soldier, trained to fight, to kill, to survive. But this? This was different. This was something he had never trained for. Something far more dangerous. You really think I can do this? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Lyra nodded slowly, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips. I know you can. But you need to trust me, Jason. Trust yourself. A long silence fell between them, broken only by the hum of the station systems. Jason turned inward again, closing his eyes as he focused on the feeling inside him. The power that had once been a chaotic, dangerous force was now something else. It was still there, still raw and untamed, but it was waiting for his command, for his focus, for him to guide it. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The energy surged, just beneath the surface, but it didn't break free. Not yet. He focused on it, felt it pulse in the depths of his chest, like a second heartbeat. It was powerful, yes. But it was his. No one else's. Not the military. Not the war. Not the mission. Mine. The realization hit him like a jolt. He had always been told what to do, who to be. But now, in this moment, he was the one making the decision. He was the one who could control the force inside him, not the other way around. The power was part of him, yes, but it didn't own him. He owned it. Slowly, cautiously, Jason reached out with his senses, feeling the power within him like a force of nature. He willed it to move, to bend to his will. And for the first time, it did. The energy pulsed gently, a soft hum that filled his body with a sensation of calm, of balance. It was still there, yes, but it was no longer a threat. It was an ally. He could feel it shift, the surge fading to a low, steady rhythm as he focused on it, guiding it with his will. Lyra watched him with quiet pride, the faintest smile on her lips as she saw the change in him. He was doing it. He was learning to control the power. It wasn't perfect, he wasn't fully in control yet, but it was a start. And for someone who had been living with this unknown force inside him for so long, that was a victory. Jason opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. He didn't speak at first, but the look in his eyes was enough. It was a look of understanding. Of acceptance. I think I can do this, he said, his voice stronger now. I can control it. I will control it. Lyra nodded, her smile widening. You will. Together, we'll make sure of it. But even as the words left her lips, a new sense of urgency began to creep into the room. The power that had been contained, now so delicately controlled, was no longer just a personal threat. It was a weapon, one that could change everything. The question was no longer whether Jason could control the energy, it was what would happen once he did. And whether the universe was ready for the consequences. The weeks that followed Jason's awakening were a blur of physical therapy, mental conditioning, and hours spent honing control over the energy that had once consumed him. Lyra was by his side every step of the way, her guidance unwavering as she taught him how to use the power within him. Together, they explored the depths of his abilities, training his mind to focus, his body to hold steady against the surges of energy that now pulsed through him. Though progress had been slow at times, Jason was steadily gaining mastery over the force. The initial tremors that had rocked his body were now replaced with a steady, practiced rhythm. He could feel the energy move within him, like a powerful river flowing just beneath the surface, and it no longer terrified him. In fact, he was starting to understand it. It wasn't a beast to be tamed, it was part of his essence. It responded to his thoughts, his emotions, and when he focused, it bent to his will. But despite the progress, there was always a lingering doubt in his mind. Could he truly control it in the face of real danger? What would happen if it broke free again, without warning? Today, however, there was no time to dwell on those thoughts. A warning signal blinked across the medical station's central console, pulling Lyra's attention away from her work. She frowned as the alert repeated, more insistent this time, flashing with red urgency. She glanced over at Jason, who was sitting cross-legged in the center of the training room, his eyes closed in concentration. The faintest hum of energy vibrated around him, though he seemed unaware of it. Lyra moved quickly, crossing the room in a few strides to activate the console. Her eyes skimmed the screen, her brow furrowing as she processed the data. There was an incoming vessel, a military transport, unidentified, and it was heading straight for their location. "Jason," she called out, her voice sharp, snapping him from his meditation. He opened his eyes and immediately stood, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "What's happening?" he asked, his voice low, but there was no hiding the edge of tension in it. The steady rhythm of his power seemed to pulse faster, as if reacting to the rising urgency around them. Lyra's fingers flew over the controls, bringing up a real-time display of the incoming vessel. "It's not a standard transport," she said, her voice grim. "It's military, and it's heavily armed. I don't know who they are or why they're coming here, but we need to prepare for the worst." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure what the worst meant in this context, but the way Lyra spoke left no doubt that it wasn't a minor threat. "What do you need me to do?" Jason asked, already bracing himself for action. He could feel the energy surging inside him, responding to the urgency in the room. For a moment, he almost felt as though it was alive, eager to fight, to destroy, to unleash its power. Lyra didn't hesitate. "I need you to stay calm. If we're going to survive whatever's coming, I need you to focus. You've been training, but this is different. This is real. You need to hold steady, Jason. No matter what happens." Jason's jaw clenched, his muscles tensing in preparation. The power inside him was rising, the pull of it nearly impossible to ignore. But Lyra was right, this wasn't the time for him to lose control. Not when people's lives were at stake. He nodded. "I'll stay focused. But I need to know what they're after. What are they going to do?" Lyra paused for a moment, her expression pained. "I don't know. But I have a feeling we're not just being attacked because of your powers. There's something more here. Something they want. And it might have to do with you." Jason's chest tightened as the weight of her words settled over him. He wasn't just a soldier now. He was a weapon, and whoever was coming for him wouldn't hesitate to use him. "Do you think they'll try to take me?" Jason asked, his voice low, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. His instincts told him they weren't coming for peace talks or diplomacy. The cold calculation in Lyra's tone told him the same. Whoever these people were, they saw him as a tool. A weapon to be wielded. "I'm afraid so," Lyra said, her voice strained. "I don't know what they'll do, but we can't take any chances. We need to get to the hangar, find out what they're doing, and stop them before they can get to you." Jason didn't waste a moment. Without another word, he turned and sprinted out of the room, Lyra close behind him. His mind was racing, and the energy inside him was thrumming with purpose. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about protecting everyone around him. Protecting Lyra. He couldn't let anyone control him again, not after everything he'd fought to reclaim. The narrow corridors of the station seemed to stretch on forever, but Jason's feet barely touched the ground as he ran, the pulse of his power aiding his speed. The hum in his chest grew louder, more insistent, urging him forward. His breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to push down the urge to unleash it all at once, to feel the surge of energy tear through him. He needed to stay focused. He needed to remain in control. They reached the hangar just as the warning klaxons began to blare, and the station's defense systems came online. The walls around them trembled as massive gates began to seal the hangar bay, locking out any potential threats. Jason and Lyra made their way to the control center, where they were met with a view of the incoming ship on the monitor. It was massive, far larger than the transport ships Jason had encountered during his military days. Its sleek, angular design suggested it was built for stealth and firepower. Jason could feel the heat building in his chest as the ship drew nearer, the power inside him itching to break free. The ship was only moments away from docking, and already he could sense the presence of soldiers on board, ready to disembark. He could feel the cold anticipation of a battle waiting to unfold. Lyra was at the console, her hands flying over the controls as she brought up a map of the station's defenses. "We don't have much time," she said urgently. "The ship will dock in 5 minutes. If we don't act now, they'll overwhelm the hangar and force their way inside." Jason felt his muscles tighten, his body already bracing for the conflict ahead. He could feel the energy inside him, rising to a boiling point, its power calling to him like a siren song. It would be so easy to unleash it, to let it flood his veins and tear through the air, to reduce everything in his path to ash. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not until he knew what he was up against. Lyra turned to him, her face grim. "Jason, we need to move fast. Are you ready?" He met her gaze, the weight of her question pressing on him. Was he ready? For the first time since his transformation, he truly didn't know. But he didn't have a choice. "I'm ready," he said, his voice low but determined. And as the ship's engines roared closer, Jason knew one thing for certain: he was about to be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. And the power inside him would either save them, or destroy everything. The ship docked with a thunderous vibration that seemed to shake the entire station. Jason could feel the force of it through the soles of his boots, reverberating through his bones as the power inside him grew more restless. His chest was tight, and his hands tingled with the sensation of energy building just beneath the surface. The beast inside him was awake again, eager to break free, to fight. Lyra didn't hesitate. She grabbed his arm, pulling him from the control center and toward the armory. The walls around them hummed with the low vibrations of the ship's approach, the distant sound of metallic locks sliding into place, sealing the station's airlocks in anticipation of the impending invasion. "We're running out of time," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to take them by surprise. The station's defenses are good, but if they board us, we can't let them breach any more areas. We need to strike fast." Jason nodded, his breath shallow as his pulse quickened. He could feel the adrenaline surging through him now, the steady, rhythmic hum of the power inside his body matching the heightened tempo of his heart. It was almost as if his very blood was attuned to the impending battle. "Let's do this," he said quietly. Lyra led him to a side entrance of the hangar bay, where they could take cover behind a series of cargo crates. They crouched behind them, listening. The station was eerily silent except for the low hum of machinery and the distant thrum of the docking ship's engines. Jason's pulse raced, and with every passing second, the power inside him flared, like a star growing hotter, ready to explode. From their vantage point, they could see the massive hangar doors begin to open, the shadows of the soldiers outside stretching into the bay. Jason squinted into the dim light. His eyes narrowed as he saw figures moving, armored soldiers clad in dark combat suits and carrying advanced weaponry. They were well prepared, a trained military force. But Jason's mind was focused on something far more dangerous than their weapons. This is it. Lyra crouched low beside him, her voice barely a whisper. You're ready. Hold steady, Jason. Don't let them draw you out before you're in control. Jason could feel the heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe slowly. Lyra's words echoed in his mind. Stay in control. It was a mantra now, something he had to remind himself of constantly. The power wanted to explode. It wanted to rage out of him like a tidal wave, to tear through everything in its path. But if he lost himself to it, they would both be lost. The first soldier stepped through the door, his footfall heavy against the floor. He moved cautiously, scanning the hangar. Behind him, a dozen more soldiers followed, their weapons drawn and their eyes alert. They hadn't noticed Jason and Lyra yet, but it was only a matter of time. Jason's hands were shaking, the urge to unleash the power within him growing with every second that passed. His chest ached. The energy in his veins roiling like a storm, as if it had been waiting for this moment. Lyra's steady presence beside him helped anchor him, but the temptation to let the power loose was overwhelming. Suddenly, one of the soldiers turned and spotted them. Cover, the soldier shouted, raising his weapon. In an instant, the room exploded into chaos. The soldiers took cover behind crates, returning fire with precision and speed. Jason barely had time to process the first burst of laser fire before his instincts took over. Without thinking, he sprang from behind the crate, his body moving faster than he had ever thought possible. The power inside him surged, flooding his limbs with energy, and in an instant, his hand extended toward the incoming fire. He didn't try to control it, he simply let it happen. A shockwave of pure force erupted from him, a blast of energy that sent the first wave of soldiers flying backward, their bodies slammed into the walls with sickening thuds. The air around him shimmered, the residual heat of his power warping the space as he pushed the energy outward. The soldiers didn't even have time to react before they were overwhelmed, sent crashing to the floor in disarray. Lyra moved fast, her own combat training kicking in as she took advantage of the chaos. She used a sidearm to incapacitate a few of the soldiers who managed to recover, but Jason barely noticed. His focus was entirely consumed by the power inside him, the wild, uncontrollable beast that had once threatened to consume him. Another wave of soldiers charged, firing rapidly. Jason could hear their shots but couldn't feel the fear anymore. There was only the power, and his mind was locked in on it, using it like a weapon. With a thought, he released another blast, this one more controlled than the first. The soldiers were knocked off their feet, but this time they didn't stay down. One soldier, a larger man with a glowing green visor, crouched and aimed a high-powered energy rifle directly at Jason. The rifle hummed with dangerous power, and Jason could feel the heat of it long before it fired. He barely had time to react. But the power inside him was already reacting. In a split second, Jason's body surged with energy, and the blast from the rifle deflected harmlessly off an invisible shield, leaving the soldier staring in shock. Jason could feel the shield around him like an extension of his own skin, a force of will that had materialized in the face of the weapon. His heart raced with the realization that he had just used the power in a way he hadn't yet learned to control, but it had worked. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. Jason. We need to fall back. They're regrouping. Jason nodded, barely hearing her over the hum of the power that was still coursing through his veins. He pushed forward, the surge of energy pushing him to new heights of speed and strength. He tore through the hangar, blasting aside anyone who dared to stand in his way. It was a blur of motion, strikes, energy pulses, bodies hitting the walls, the floor, anything that came in contact with his power. And then, it was over. The soldiers were either incapacitated or fleeing, some of them scrambling to regroup, others too stunned to move. Jason stood in the center of the hangar, his chest heaving with exhaustion, sweat dripping from his brow. The energy still hummed inside him, but now it was fading, retreating into the depths of his being. Lyra appeared beside him, her face a mix of awe and concern. You did it," she said, breathless. Jason's legs felt like they might give out beneath him, but he stood firm, his heart still pounding in his chest. The power inside him had been unleashed, and it had saved them. But there was a terrifying truth he now had to confront. He had just tapped into a fraction of what he could do, and if he wasn't careful, it could be the end of them all. "I didn't lose control," Jason said, his voice hoarse. He didn't know whether it was a question or a statement, but the fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface. He could feel the power inside him, still waiting, still eager for more. Lyra's expression softened. "No. You didn't. You're ready now, Jason. But remember, this isn't just about power. It's about knowing when to use it. When to hold back." Jason nodded, his hands trembling slightly. He knew that Lyra was right. The power was his, but it would never be his master. Not again. They had won the battle, but the war, both outside and within, was far from over. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.